Hi, I'm Cynthia Koons. I cover healthcare at Bloomberg. I'm joined today by Rhonda Morris, Chief Human Resources Officer at Chevron, a company that's won awards for its approach to mental health and substance abuse in the workplace, and also Patrick Kennedy, a former congressman who founded the Kennedy Foundation. And in his work, he helps elevate the dialogue about mental health in corporations and on a national level to help raise awareness about mental health. And we're here today to talk about mental health in the workplace, and particularly how trends have evolved through COVID, which has been a trying time for workers in any industry, you name it. Everyone has faced it and dealt with it. And we're here to talk a little bit about how companies have been approaching this problem. And so, Rhonda, I wanted to start with you because you had told me that at Chevron, you survey your workforce and you try to take the pulse and see what's been going on. I'm curious what you've been hearing lately as we're entering this new phase in the pandemic where maybe the most intense lockdowns have eased in many parts of the world, but sort of the chronic stress has accumulated and people are facing having to re-enter a life that they've left behind now for over a year. So I'm curious what you're hearing now and what you at Chevron and your group are trying to do to better support employees and let them know what you have available to them.
Well, thank you for the question. Now, we do survey our employees, and we have 40,000 employees in 55 countries, and every possible sort of incarnation of what people are dealing with, I think, exists in our organization. We have 65% of our employees who are working remotely, and the other 35% have never stopped going to his or her workplace. And those are employees on offshore platforms, in refineries, on ships, in terminals. And what we do to get sentiment from them is we survey them, and we started surveying them even more frequently during the pandemic. We have what's called a Chevron employee survey, and we ask questions that are pretty far-reaching from how is your supervisor treating you? Do you feel valued at work? And we ask a lot of questions about health and well-being, and specifically mental health. And what we have noticed as we're entering this new phase is we have an issue and a problem that I think is pervasive throughout most companies, and that's people are tired and they're fatigued, and they're sharing sentiment with us about well-being. And based on what our employees share with us, that's how we cater our employee assistance program and the support that we provide them. We don't have a static program. The offerings that we share are really directly correlated to what feedback we get from the workforce.
Well, Patrick, in your work, you talk to companies in all different industries and you sort of have a finger on the pulse of what's going on around the country. What would you say companies have gotten right throughout the pandemic? And what are some things they may not have gotten right and where there's still room for improvement in the corporate approach to mental health in the workplace?
Well, let's first acknowledge that we've gone through this real inflection point in the appreciation for how critical mental health is in the workplace because of, as you know, Rhonda, the turnover in employment just generally across the globe. I mean, most businesses are looking at almost up to 40% of their workforce want to change jobs. And the churn is a heavy price on companies. So they have to figure out, how do we hire new ones that are qualified, and how do we retain the ones we already have? And now mental health is not just kind of some side benefit EAP over here that's rarely kind of pushed out, unlike what Chevron does, where, you know, the incentive, in fact, in the EAP is not to have anyone know about it because the profit goes to those that don't spend it. So, you know, we need to just change up that whole paradigm, because now this is an existential crisis for corporate American businesses around the world, and that is, how do they keep the functioning business going forward? And it rests upon the stress level and the burnout level, the feeling of purpose in the place of employment, the feeling, as you point out, Rhonda, of connection with their managers, the feeling of community amongst their coworkers. And frankly, what do their benefits look like? Because if they have kids like mine who have had struggles, we had to bring in some teletherapy for our daughter. Like, if I didn't know somebody to make sure that got in network, I would have been sidelined as a parent. So a lot of the smarter, forward-thinking businesses are expanding their EAPs to the whole family. They're ensuring that there's in-network adequate care for not just the employee, but their family. So there's just a lot happening. I'm very excited because as an advocate, we've been kind of pushing uphill to try to get adoption of mental health. You know, when I was in Congress, I wrote the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, which basically said you had to include mental health and addiction in your benefits if you offered mental health, and they had to be on par with the rest of medical care. Now, in fact, insurance companies want to go even further because their employers, which are the corporations who they work for, are telling them we want more mental health, because not only does it drive down the total cost of care, but it also has huge ripple effects on presenteeism, absenteeism, and disability costs. And as I said, the churn, which means that a business needs to emphasize to their third-party administrator that there's a greater fiduciary than at the stake of the insurer than they realize, because they don't see all the additional positives that come from them spending more on mental health in the healthcare part in terms of the rest of the workforce. But as fiduciaries at the business, you see the total impact of more mental health, which is not just reflected in lesser total medical costs, but actually in these other things that payers are not, incorporating into their metrics of their costs. So it's trying to align these incentives so that we get more for the employees, so that businesses are more productive overall.
Yeah, so what you're referring to there for people who may not follow this as closely is this concept of presenteeism and absenteeism and the knock-on effects in the workplace of people suffering with mental health conditions and not being able to get treatment. Rhonda, I'm curious how your EAP utilization has tracked throughout the pandemic in terms of your own workers turning to your employee assistance program as a source of help. Have they been doing that? Have they been reaching out? Has your EAP been able to accommodate the demand? Curious how that's sort of played out throughout this pandemic.
So I'll set some context first. We have had in-house EAP for 52 years, which is probably a surprise to many individuals. And they do a lot of metrics tracking. So I'll share two specific areas. One area they measure our individual employee outreach to our EAP counselors. And the other is supervisor or group / organization outreach for help for a work group. From an individual standpoint, we saw a fairly significant increase in outreach at the beginning of the pandemic, and we think that that's fairly normal. In fact, in both areas, the outreach went up over 100% at the beginning of the pandemic. Between 2020 and 2019, the percentage of supervisors who were reaching out to our EAP team on different ways and tools they could use to help manage the anxiety of a remote working workforce or a workforce of individuals who were continuing to go to the office, or even a group of rotators we have. These are people who are working on projects who have to constantly shift which locations they're in. They lean pretty heavily on our EAP team to provide them with outreach. And I believe the percentage increase from 2019 to 2020 was 145%. And we've also looked at it from 2020 to 2021, and it has leveled off dramatically as we move into this sort of vaccination environment. And we are I don't like the term new normal, but learning how we live with it, with all types of different uncertainties that are in front of us.
Yeah, these are different dimensions of stress. I think there were lockdowns and there was the acute stress of that, and now there's the reality for a lot of people that they may have children at home that are not vaccinated, but they're vaccinated. So it seems like the stress is shifting, not entirely going away, but hopefully heading in the right direction. Patrick, when you look at the amount that teletherapy has been utilized, and you mentioned being able to utilize it within your own family, that's really filled a gap here. Curious if you think that's here to stay, and if there are any risks to teletherapy being used in place of the sort of brick and mortar care that some people may need for more severe conditions? And are there any like ways for companies to make sure people are getting the right kind of care for their specific problems?
Right. So you had all the right points in there, which is yes, teletherapy is awesome. It's expanding, options to people who never otherwise would have been able to get care next Thursday at 10 a.m. across town when they didn't have transportation and they were working. I mean, thank God for telemental health. Now it's really universalizing the ability for outreach. But two, we need to make sure that it is evidence-based. So we can't just have this free-for-all kind of Wild West of, quote, therapists who you're not quite sure if they're trained to best address your type of diagnosis. As you know, I'm the co-founder of Psych Hub, and we're partnering with businesses around the world to curate therapy by diagnosis and the evidence-based treatment for that diagnosis. God forbid we not treat all of these as individual cases, because that's how we treat cancer. We use this personalized medicine approach. We should do the same in mental health, especially if we want better outcomes. And unfortunately, in the United States, and I think around the world, we're not seeing the adherence to cognitive behavioral therapy as an evidence form of treatment widely applied, and we need to change that if we want to get the results that we need. And finally, there's no way to take for granted that teletherapy is going to virtual help is going to continue, because I hate to say it, but politics is politics. Unless people demand it, we won't have it continue. And I agree with you. The top priority here are kids, because while we have a dearth of adequate professionals in the mental health space to begin with, that particularly feels the worst when it comes to addressing the needs of our kids, which means we need all hands on deck wherever they may be. And I'm for taking on whatever association of therapists say that it's their purview who gets to treat patients in a given state. That if they do that, they will be impeding the welfare and benefits of those kids in that state if there's not enough therapists to provide that care. So I hope I see none of these associations, because there's plenty of business to go around erecting these false barriers to access to care, and we need a fight on that. That's not a given that we're going to win this. There's powerful lobbies within each of these states of trade groups in the mental health space that are going to hold on to, quote, their turf, frankly, at the expense of the broader need. We have to remind them there's going to be enough for everybody. We're only scratching the surface of those that currently need care. So let's not get into a turf war here. Let's join together and meet the bigger needs that our country has.
Definitely, yeah. So for those who didn't follow, part of that sort of development was during COVID, the federal government waived state licensing regulations, allowing therapists to work with patients in other states. And that really corrected the supply-demand imbalance that we had seen prior to COVID. And so I think the thinking there is that the government needs to continue with that, correct, Patrick, in terms of keeping this supply adequately available to people all over the country?
Yeah, no, Cynthia, you've articulated a lot better than I did, but I think that the politics are, let's start with kids and let's make a win for kids. And then once we've done that, I think we've de-risked, well, okay, it's not the end of the world for these various professional groups in each state. We can expand it because the nation demands it. And then, frankly, a lot of therapists like the virtual care. They can see patients in a way that best works with their time. And we need to make sure payers reimburse for teletherapy in a parity way, because we know it's just as effective, again, provided that it's evidence-based. So, and as I said, the ability to match, like a Match.com, for your therapy to be culturally competent, okay, so your therapist looks like you or has a similar LGBTQ background as you, or has a gender background that will allow you to be able to share about, sexual trauma or women's issues. I mean, all of those things are crucial to the effectiveness of therapy, which you can't just get if you're looking at geolocation around my neighborhood in South Jersey. Like my child's therapy is actually better because I'm able to tap someone with that type of expertise from around the country. And don't we want that for all of our families?
That makes a lot of sense to me. Rhonda, have you ended up using at Chevron teletherapy as a way to help support more workers than you had previously? Have you expanded any of those offerings? I know you mentioned you had your in-house EAP, so I wondered what supplemented that with this increase in demand like you described.
Exactly what Patrick described is exactly how we dealt with the shortage of support, especially during COVID. Our team worked very, very closely with our current partners to source resources outside of California and Houston and all the states in the U.S. where we operated. And we recognize, again, there is a shortage of therapists, but at the same time, the relaxation of these regulations or rules really did help our employees get access to care when they needed it. If that had not happened, I don't think we would have been able to address as effectively the number of issues that were brought to our attention and the care that our employees needed. And especially even with the children. And I agree with what Patrick said about we've got to focus on children and their learning and their anxiety and their stress. And we did use a number of in-house resources to address that. And we use the external resources within the states where we operate, and we use telehealth outside. And we're probably, and one of the things we've been looking at is what do we continue doing? A number of the resources, because initially our focus was really on Chevron employees and their partners. And children had benefits that were available to them, but over time we recognize that we really need to do more for them. And even post-pandemic, we're going to continue focusing on support for the children of our employees.
So
yeah, Sharon,
we're coming up on time. Yes. Yeah.
So, a generation ago, businesses impressed upon the society that we needed to ramp up math and science. And so we got STEM education. And I think businesses need to ramp up their political pressure on our education system to emphasize social emotional learning and neuroliteracy and promoting coping mechanism development and problem solving skills, because businesses today are recognizing the absolute necessity of having a workforce that is able to navigate their own feelings and stresses and emotions in a way that is not counterproductive. And just like a generation ago, we had to strengthen our math and science, I think next generation, we need to strengthen our social emotional skills, which I think our businesses can now drive that advocacy. Just a little plug in there. Chevron's been a great champion for the cause, so thank you.
Thank you.
So if you, I'll throw this over to you, Rhonda, and then also Patrick, but what would be your advice, given some of the work you've done at Chevron and what you've seen throughout the pandemic, to a company trying to beef up their internal resources or even secure the kind of external resources that could be adequately utilized to help people really cope through these continuing uncertain times?
So I'll be quick. I recognize we're running out of time. I would say, number one, really listen to your employees. And there are a whole lot of different ways you can do that. I mentioned surveys earlier. We do a lot of town halls. We have lots of mechanisms for our employees to tell us what's really going on with them. So number one, I would say, listen. And number two, we're a company, I believe, of creative problem solvers. There is no silver bullet that's going to solve mental health issues in America or even in the world. So we're going to keep trying things that work, and we're going to, and if they don't work, we're going to try things that are different. So don't look for the silver bullet, and listen to your workforce and adjust what you're doing accordingly as conditions change.
Yeah,
and
to that, I would only add that we need to educate the workforce to how to respond to their fellow coworkers who might be having difficulty, and how to get them the help they need, and how to support people who might be in long-term recovery to feel like they're working in a safe environment. And we need to get education for that through the workforce training, and include that in the diversity, inclusion, and education, and all the other mandated trainings that need to take place in a business. We need to make sure that there is competence amongst not only the managerial staff, but everybody, that they know how to be a quote first responder or an ally for someone suffering from a mental illness, or know how to talk about it so that they can get them the help that I love to hear that you're doing at Chevron and other companies are doing by expanding EAPs dramatically, and obviously also making sure that their insurers have adequate in-network benefits so their employees have timely access to care.